What is up, Simply the West Nation? Welcome to another episode of our podcast where we talk all things Big Ten West football. We call it the Big Ten's better half. Whether that's actually accurate remains to be seen in the coming days, weeks, and months. But speaking of the calendar, Blake Molly, I don't know how it's been down in the good life, as they call Nebraska, but Minnesota has been unseasonably warm. If there's one thing Nebraskans and Minnesotans like to talk about more than football, it might be the weather. And things are certainly heating up as it's somehow already week 4 of college football season, and we are getting into the thick of conference play. My friend, good to see you again. Cheers, as always.
Yeah, I cannot wait. This is honestly, I love this type of weather. I love getting the grill out and having grill going in the morning, having a nice burger on the grill. I tell you what, this season has been so frustrating. And really, the reason why, you know what it's like? It's honestly like having a meal that is really good, but too small. And that's what's happening. And we're finally getting into that part of the season. This happened to me tonight. My wife was making, she's become this gourmet chef when it comes to making burgers. And I know that sounds crazy, but every time I even smell it before it's even cooked, my mouth starts watering. And then she had it tonight, but she only made enough for one for one person to have only one. That sucked because I wanted so much more. And it's a testament to how good of a cook she is because that's what it was. And I don't know how good Nebraska is. I don't know how good Wisconsin is, even though I think they're freaking amazing and they've shut everybody out. Iowa, I can't tell either. There was times where I thought they looked terrible against Iowa State. Then Illinois drops a pooper on Eastern Michigan. This is ridiculous. Purdue has no depth. They lost their quarterback. He's got concussion. It's so frustrating. Now, every week, we're getting into Big Ten play. We're going to figure out who's any good. Oh, my gosh. I can't wait to get into it. Let's get this podcast started so we can talk more about who's good, who's not good, and what are we going to find out.
Absolutely, yeah. It feels more like maybe July than September outside. Blake and his lovely wife have the grill going. I, for our YouTube viewers, am doing my best to beat the heat here in Minnesota. What are you washing down that fine, but maybe not substantial enough meal with tonight, Blake? As always, we try to feature different beers from around the Big Ten West locales. What are you drinking tonight, my friend?
I am drinking the Extra Citra Pale Ale from Surly Brewing Company. And correct me if I'm wrong, they're Minneapolis or are they St. Paul?
I've heard of Surly before. They're kind of right on that border that straddles the abyss between Minneapolis and St. Paul. I believe if you look up their address, it is on the Minneapolis side, fairly close to downtown. Next time you're up here, if anybody's in the Twin Cities, go to Surly Brewery. One of the best brewery experiences you'll ever have. Great food, great patio. Great live music a lot. So yeah, it's fantastic.
Award-winning food. Now this Extra Citra Pale Ale, I really like citrusy, like very fruity flavored pale ale.
That explains a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. I really like that because it kind of bites, but it has just enough. And when you can drink a lot more of the pale ales if it has enough citrus in it. So I would say it rivals the Ranger IPAs or the Juicy Voodoo Ranger IPA from New Belgium Brewery. But go ahead and check it out if you get a chance. Plus, they have really cool artwork on the Surly brews. I like them. What are you drinking?
Yeah, Surly is a staple here in the Twin Cities. I have ventured across the border to the land of cheeseheads and gone with a good old classic, the Leinenkugels, the pride of Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. Blake and I both have some friends from that town. I think we've both been to that brewery on 1 or 2 occasions, and you can't go wrong with the Leinies. This is a canoe paddler. This is another one of those beers that I feel like you can drink on a hot day like we've had lately or in the middle of winter. Really balanced, a nice Kolsch style beer that they brew. Leinie's, I really associate them more with summer and, a nice summer shandy. They have a lot of good shandies that you can take out on the pontoon or sit out and enjoy after mowing the lawn. But the canoe paddler's a little more of a beery beer. So definitely enjoying that. And it's a good time of year for it.
Hey, you know what's funny is that you say that. I've always associated them with really good winter beers. And my favorite is their award-winning Creamy Dark. So
yeah,
shout out to all my Liney's fans out there.
Yeah, they've got a good range. Well, speaking of range, we're going to be kind of all over the board. There is a lot to talk about this week, again, as we get into conference play. Again, we have power rankings this week, so we'll kind of unveil those as we go along. Blake will talk about his picks against the spread or over-unders from kind of a gambling standpoint. Wisconsin, Michigan, kind of the A topic this week. We will get into that. So as Blake said, let's get after it. And we're going to start with the first matchup for the Cornhuskers of Nebraska, where Blake lives and where I'm from. First conference matchup for the Huskers after kind of getting back on track against Northern Illinois last week. As you mentioned, Illinois, Nebraska's opponent this Saturday, really kind of laid an egg against an Eastern Michigan team that it probably could have beat by a couple touchdowns if it hadn't shot itself in the foot so many times. It will be an interesting game to see, can the Illini get back on track, and has Nebraska figured some things out in terms of being able to run the football? That offense has gotten a little bit better every game. Adrian Martinez looks a little more comfortable every game. This will be another test. First Big Ten game. It's on the road for Nebraska. And, the keys I look at, Blake, really come down to both teams' ground games and run defense. Illini yielding just 79.3 yards per game on the ground. That's 17th in the country. Despite the loss to Eastern Michigan, there are some athletes on that Illinois defense. Again, so many of these stats are kind of qualified with the competition that these teams have played. We'll learn more about just how well Illinois can stack up, but we will about Nebraska too. Number 20 run defense in the country, and they've really zeroed in this week on running back Reggie Corbin from Illinois. He is averaging 7.5 yards per carry through 3 games. So it's really going to come down to who can win those battles in the trenches and get the ground game going at 7 p.m. Central this Saturday on Big Ten Network.
Yeah, and you just got to look at this, that, Illinois actually has a lot of skill guys. But as we're actually, this is going to be a theme of this week, the D-line and O-line make a huge difference between how good your skill players can actually play. Peters can make some throws against zone. He's okay against some man-to-man. Man-to-man, typically you need to have very pinpoint accuracy, lots of great touch. Zone, you're just thrown into windows and having the guy go catch it in between. So that's why quarterbacks typically can, if they have time, can pick apart zones. Peters, and he can move a little bit too. So he's got a little bit of run. He's not the most athletic guy, but we'll see. And then the Husker O-line. Illinois has a smallish, very athletic, a lot of, I'd call them like forwards on a basketball team guys. Not a lot of these big 330-pound run stuffers or even 290, 280-pounder guys. These guys are just athletes that go out and do a lot of stunting. They can stop the run, but they don't have a lot of depth. So if you can actually run on them, this might get ugly really fast. But I haven't seen Nebraska's O-line really protect Taylor Martinez. Even against Northern Illinois, they were getting pressure on him. They were getting pressure on Taylor. Or did I say Taylor Martinez? I keep wanting to say 2 a.m. and Taylor Martinez. Adrian Martinez.
It's an easy mistake that we all continue to make.
No, but I've been doing it a lot lately. My dad caught it on the last podcast. Not cool.
I wonder what old Taylor Martinez is up to these days. We should look into that and circle back on that. He's working
in New York. I'm LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn with him.
Oh, good for you. I know he was in like app development after school. He kind of worked for a startup or two there in developing an app. So good for Team Magic. Gosh, he was fun to watch.
Yeah, when he was healthy. And then the DBs. Honestly, they don't have very good DBs. That's honestly what it's coming down to. But if there's no time, who knows what's going to happen? We saw that 2 a.m. couldn't get a lot of stuff going. He was very inconsistent. A lot of short throws that had to go for, or just like boom or bust stuff. He didn't have a lot of time, and that's really what it's going to come down to this week.
Sure. Two more really important storylines coming out of Nebraska's 44-8 win over Northern Illinois. Number one, the kicking game. Starting kicker hurt before the first game of the year. Barrett Pickering hasn't kicked yet in a game this year. Backup kicker Dylan Jorgensen, walk on, hurt, out. Nebraska has turned to its club soccer team trying to build depth. They've had Isaac Armstrong kick. He obviously missed the kick in overtime against Colorado. He's their punter, very good punter. Hasn't done a whole lot of place kicking, especially on short notice in his life. They even have a safety who transferred from Air Force who's done some kicking that they had kick and actually had a pretty nice kick in that game. Blake, have you ever watched a game or been part of a game at any level where 5 kicks were blocked? That Northern Illinois game was had some putrid special teams play, really, by both teams.
Yes. I mean, I've never had that happen, but it was putrid. Nebraska, I'm not that worried because we don't need to be worried until Ohio State and some other teams. Honestly, there's only a couple games where I'm thinking that the kicking game is going to become an issue. But if you are in games, close games, that's really where it's going to come down to. Hopefully, Nebraska get Barrett Pickering back. And it stinks because the special teams has been terrible for the last couple years anyways. Now we have pretty much everything's working really well except for the kicking game because 3 kickers have gotten hurt.
Yeah, so we'll see what happens. And then finally, this blew up on social media, and I don't know why. And it's 2019, and silly things just happen, it seems to be. But Scott Frost's pants were essentially trending locally in Nebraska. Apparently, Scott Frost wears kind of tight pants. Those aren't the types of things I'm noticing during the course of a college football game, especially when it comes to the Huskers. But pretty humorous how that kind of has blown up and become a silly topic of conversation. I suppose when those are the things people are pointing fun at you on social media for, that's a better place than Nebraska's been in the past couple years. Maybe that's a way to look at it.
You know what that takes?
I do.
It takes balls.
Yeah. And with that, we'll move on to Minnesota. By the way, we talked about power rankings. We've got Nebraska at number 3. They move up 1 spot this week after looking pretty good overall against Northern Illinois. Illinois continues to be at the bottom of the division, especially after losing to Eastern Michigan. They are going to have to figure some things out. A lot of turnovers, a lot of mistakes in that game. We'll see if they can get back at it against the Huskers. The University of Minnesota, number 4 on our power rankings. They have a bye this weekend. Then they're at Purdue on September 28th to open conference play. Somehow, some way, one of our followers on Facebook brought this up and asked us to kind of break it down. Minnesota is 3-0, but kind of by the skin of Goldie Gopher's 2 buck teeth. The latest last-second victory over Georgia Southern, a team that I think a lot of people thought Minnesota might be able to walk all over. But we talked about it, Blake. That triple option can be difficult to defend. And there's something about these PJ Fleck teams that continue to play to their competition, whether it's up or down. Saw that again this past Saturday. And if it weren't for our guy, Tyler Johnson, finally getting going, the big whiteout from Minneapolis, Gophers could really be going into this bye week hurting, but as it stands, they eke out a last-second victory. And if there's a silver lining for them, I suppose it's that you know or assume at some point in conference play, as they try to vie for a Big Ten West championship, they're going to be in some close games, and they won't be a stranger to that because they've really all 3 of their games to date have been in doubt in the fourth quarter. They've actually trailed almost 22 minutes of football in the fourth quarter this season. So they're used to finding a way to get it done late. The flip side of that, of course, is stop putting yourself in that position by turning the ball over, committing silly penalties. That offensive line, I think, is probably underperformed to date. If they can quit making so many mental errors, I think this team could really hit a groove, but they're going to need, I think, every day available to them during this bye week to get some of that figured out.
Yeah, and it looks like the defense is really susceptible to the pass. Georgia Southern really kind of actually threw the ball a lot on them a little bit. And you know
Yeah,
what? Georgia
pass is tough to defend.
Southern's a pretty good Sun Belt team. I mean, you just look at who's in their league. The first and second place team for last year was Appalachian State, good team. They were 11-2 last year. Troy, who was 10-3 last year, and Georgia Southern was 6-2 in the division, 10-3 overall. So they're not a bad team, and that's what happens with some of these teams. Is either the coaches aren't showing enough film, or they're not stamping down and basically getting on them and calling out every little mistake. You got to get on these guys, and I'm surprised PJ let that happen. And maybe this is a good wake-up call for him because that defense really needs to work hard. I haven't seen that great of a pass rush, honestly, out of Minnesota. They're supposed to have a pretty good D line, pretty good run defense, but they're just not getting enough pass rush, and they're playing too much zone coverage, not mixing it up man zone enough.
Sure. Yeah, so we'll see what happens here in a couple weeks when they get back at it against Purdue. Moving on to Iowa, they check in at number 2 in our power rankings. We talked about the weather a little bit off the top. Blake, is the Cy-Hawk Trophy game still in a rain delay?
Holy crap.
It was such a strange day.
Yeah, and that, I think, it might have been the difference in the game because Iowa that plays into their style of football. But what the funny thing about that Iowa game is that Iowa State was playing a 3-3-5, so they had 3 down linemen, 3 linebackers, and 5 defensive backs, and they couldn't run the ball. They only had 113 yards rushing, if I remember correctly, and only 200 yards passing. They had, I mean, in this day and age, to have less than 400 yards of total offense is insane. And especially for an Iowa team that prides itself on smash mouth football, that'd be willing to run it 50 times a game and just say, hey, we'll go into it. And the crazy thing that made me not look at Iowa that great anymore. I mean, put them down a notch against Wisconsin. Hey, they were playing Iowa State, so first tough game of the year. Understandable why they didn't look as great, but they were getting pass rush with only 3 down linemen, and they couldn't block in the run game from distance, from depth. They couldn't they didn't know where guys were coming from. 3-3-5, those guys are blitzing all over the place, usually bringing 4 or 5 guys. You just don't know where that 4th or 5th guy is coming from. So it was a really, really strange game. And then but they didn't make mistakes. No turnovers. That's a staple of Iowa football. No mistakes.
Yeah, that's the recipe for success for them. There's no doubt about it. And we talked a little bit going into that game about how with that rivalry and some of these in-state rivalries, you really do kind of throw everything out the window. And that was just a bizarre game from start to finish with the rain delay, the way it ended with 2 Iowa State players essentially clocking each other, trying to field a punt with a little bit of time left on the clock. Everything in between just kind of bizarre.
What was I text you? It was like, 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I said, or I guess I can't remember what time the game was playing or whatever, but I said, what did we say? That weird poop happens all the time?
It always does when those 2 teams play. Yep, for sure. So yeah, Iowa has this next week off too, so they'll be able to lick whatever wounds they might have coming out of that game. Watched the film on it. That was a physical game too. You could hear the pads popping throughout that entire game. So Iowa, I'm sure, will relish the chance to kind of heal up a little bit. All right, things are really starting to heat up. So the bucket hat is coming off, shades off. Let's talk Wisconsin-Michigan, Blake. I have been looking forward to this game since the schedule came out. This is one of those, as just a college football fan or a fan of Big Ten football, that you kind of had circled. And we are going to learn so much more about Wisconsin and about Michigan, frankly. Big noon kickoff on Fox, 11 a.m. Central Time. Michigan 11th in the polls, Wisconsin 13. I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Gambling Expert, but Wisconsin, being the home team, is favored. Be about 3.5-point favorite, something like that.
That is consistent out in Vegas currently.
Yeah, so that
means that they like the home guy plus a half a point. I mean, sure. 3 points for basically you getting 3 points for being home.
Yeah. And a 3.5 point spread, yeah, that's close. So that's indicative of what type of game to expect. These, frankly, Blake are two teams that really feel like they have something to prove. And it starts with Michigan. It's your 5th year under Jim Harbaugh. For as much success as they've had and for as much money as Harbaugh's making, for as much revenue as that program brings in for that school and what that sport means to that state and that university, the numbers are kind of baffling. Under Harbaugh, Michigan 1-9 against top 10 teams. Now, Wisconsin just outside of that, so that won't really come into play this weekend, but it's worth bringing up. Hasn't been to a college football playoff under Harbaugh, hasn't won a Big Ten championship, and, the fans in Michigan love this, 0-4 against Ohio State. Shea Patterson, the quarterback for the Wolverines, said himself, "We're just looking to go out there, that is to Camp Randall Stadium in Madtown, and make a statement." That was his direct quote, "make a statement." Wisconsin wants to do the same thing. 8-5 last year, only team in the nation that hasn't given up a point yet. That defense has been awesome, but it hasn't necessarily been tested, at least not the way it will or could be against a team with a quarterback like Shea Patterson and some of the talent that Michigan has. We'll find out if the Badgers are for real this Saturday. It's going to be a great game. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, and you're going to just be looking at this Michigan team is really weird. They basically played right into Army's hands last week. And you know what? I'm not really going to be really that worried about Michigan yet until this week. I want to see what they do against Wisconsin. And same with Wisconsin. I haven't been worried about them until this week. We don't know based off the talent that they're playing. And now, yes, they barely beat Army, but they were basically just running into 8-man, 9-man fronts the entire game. Weren't getting the ball out to Donovan Peoples-Jones or Tariq Black. They have really good skill position players at Michigan. Now, it's going to come up front because Michigan's O-line has sucked horrible. It has been terrible. And Wisconsin keeps churning out really good D linemen and really good outside linebackers and pretty darn good defensive backs. I'm really excited to see the defensive backs go against and play their no daylight defense. I mean, keep everything in front of you. They have a very similar style to Iowa where they keep everything in front, but they close fast, they close hard, and they punish you for even trying to get the ball out to those skill guys. But the thing is they might not even get the ball because Shea Patterson's been running for his life. I'm wondering if they were just kind of playing possum. I mean, Jim Harbaugh and the Harbaughs have been known to kind of keep their offenses under wraps for a while. I don't know. And Harbaugh is supposedly not really that involved. Gaddis is his first year calling plays. He was at Alabama, but he was not calling plays. Mike Locksley was. What the heck's going on? But you know what? It's going to be great. Wisconsin. I love Wisconsin. I love Wisconsin, Camp Randall, their atmosphere, but it's really only packed for 2 quarters, the second and third quarter. People don't show up until the end of the first because they're still tailgating, or I guess there's not really that many tailgates in Wisconsin. They're all at house parties.
Yeah, house parties, plenty of bars.
With beer bongs from the second level all the way to the bottom. But yeah, they great atmosphere. They're going to be there the whole game. They're going to be rocking and rolling. I mean, this is essentially, it's a top 20 matchup, top 15 matchup. It might as well be a top 10 matchup. I'm really excited to see how this is going to look. Hopefully we have a good game this weekend.
Yeah, it should be a lot of fun. It's another chance for us to watch Jonathan Taylor do his thing too, and that's always exciting in and of itself. We'll talk a little more about him toward the end of this week's episode. A prediction, Blake. We've talked about who we like to come out of the West. I'm still sticking with Nebraska, despite its woes to come out the gates. You've leaned toward Wisconsin. Is this a preview of the Big Ten championship game, do you think?
No.
Ohio State?
Ohio State.
Hard not to pick against them. Hard to pick against them, rather. They have looked phenomenal under Coach Day.
Yeah, but who cares? Who have they played? You don't know how good they're going. Honestly, we don't even know how good they're really going to be until after the Nebraska game. And not even the Nebraska game, because we won't know how good Nebraska is until
Assuming they
Ohio
take
State.
care of business against
Yeah.
Illinois. Yep,
It's-
that's going to be a
it's-
fun one in 2 weeks.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm looking at them. I mean, I think we both kind of have them. Right now, it's number 3 in our Big Ten West power rankings. They're not quite as good as Iowa and Wisconsin, but they should be better than Northwestern, Purdue, and all these other teams. And I really still feel this way. They could bite any of those teams above them, but I think Ohio State has, over the last couple of years, proven that they're a notch above even the Iowas and the Wisconsins of the world.
Well, sure, and they may have changed coaches, but that doesn't mean that the talent they've been able to recruit
Their
all of a
defense is
sudden
better.
jumped ship. They're insanely athletic, especially on that side of the ball.
Yeah, their defense is better. Only thing I worry about is Justin Fields has been running a lot. If he gets hurt, what do they have behind him?
Sure. Well, knock on wood for him because he's been fun to watch as well. We'll talk more about the Buckeyes, I'm sure, throughout the rest of this season as we get into Big Ten play. Moving back down toward the bottom of our power rankings, Purdue. How worried should Purdue be after that loss to TCU?
I'd be more worried about getting healthy. Honestly, if Sindelar didn't play. And what was the final score? It was like 35-10, 35-7 or something. I can't even remember at this point, but I just remember looking at him like going, what the heck happened to this? There's no scoring. And then I looked and Sindelar didn't play. There was like some guy that he was a true freshman or something, or even a walk-on. And I'm like, what the heck? Their running back gets hurt. They barely had a running game before that. They have 5 starters that are out with injury. It comes down to the D-line and the O-line. They have no depth up there. Their D-line's pretty athletic, but they don't have anything behind them. O-line cannot protect that long, and they can't run the ball. They have good skill guys, can't get enough time to get the ball in space. On defensive side, can't stop the run, so the skill guys are catching them at 5, 7, 8 yards beyond the line of scrimmage. I'm not. I mean, yes, it stinks because you're kind of wasting a year of Rondale Moore and a couple other skill guys that they have. So that stinks for them. But I wouldn't be terribly worried because, like we've said, this is probably the best teams that the West has produced. But any of them is susceptible to a big night of scoring.
Yeah, absolutely. Sindelar being out hurts. Hopefully he's able to get back soon. Other thing with Purdue you have to think about is if they could find a way to get some semblance of a running game going, that would make that pass threat to Rondale Moore and some of those other skill guys a little more viable. Their ground games were pretty much non-existent. You can kind of sit back and really focus on defending those guys in the back end if they could get the ground game going a little more, even if it's some jet sweeps with more, some misdirection, even just running him across the formation so you make the defense think twice. Jeff Brom's a smart guy. He knows way more about football than you and I do. No offense. I'm sure they'll try to get it figured out. And if they're not vying for a division title, they're going to figure into things because they still have enough talent to trip folks up as we saw last year. And Ohio State, speaking of the Buckeyes fans, know all too well. Finally, number 5 in our power rankings, Northwestern. I should mention Purdue is off this week, so they'll get a chance to nurse some of those injuries. Northwestern, a decent win against UNLV. What did you take away from that? I kind of felt like it was one of those games where maybe the final score doesn't necessarily, indicate where a team is at, but how are the Fighting Fitzes looking in the great football mind that belongs to Blake Molly at this point in the season?
Scary. They still won the game, so it doesn't matter. Win's a win. Hunter Johnson looks terrible.
You are not on Team Hunter Johnson whatsoever.
Hey, I thought that he might be the reason why they'll be even better, but he's actually been terrible. This guy was rated higher than Tua Tagovailoa when he came out of high school. He was the 5-star general that was going to come in after getting beat out by or Trevor Lawrence out at Clemson. He only had a 48% completion percentage against UNLV, who has one of the worst defenses in the country.
Sure.
Could have been a good game, but this is a trend. I mean, Hunter Johnson looked terrible. He got replaced by TJ Green, who promptly breaks his foot and has to have surgery. I don't know how long he's out. Could be a month. It could be even longer. It could be 6 weeks. They need to figure out a way to get Hunter Johnson going. And I don't know what they have behind him. So if he gets hurt, they might be screwed. So they might not be able to run him, even though he's a little athletic. And then they play Michigan State this week, who we thought that they turned the corner and they had a ton of points the 2 weeks prior, and then they lose 10-7 to Arizona State.
And when was the last time a Pac-12 team even played in a game with a score that low? That was unbelievable.
Is this game even going to have 20 points scored?
I'll have to see what happens. I think it could be a chance for Michigan State's offense, which has been maligned for the better part of the last season plus, to maybe do some things against that Northwestern defense.
Don't talk against Patty Fisher that way.
Yeah, I'm sure Patty Fisher would eat my lunch if he was here. So that one is at 11 a.m. on ABC, kind of getting things going this Saturday. It could be a good matchup as well. Definitely will be a slobber knocker of a Big Ten football game. So Northwestern checks in at number 5. Let's get to our stories of the week. I'll go ahead and do the honors first. I want to talk a little more about Jonathan Taylor. We've sung his praises on this podcast every single episode we've done in the long-standing 4-week history of the show. Obviously, you watch the highlights, you hear his name, you see him on SportsCenter. You can see everything he can do on the field. Anybody who's following college football knows he's at the very least a dark horse Heisman candidate. He's a 2-time All-American and has really on his way to kind of rewriting some of college football's record books. But if you look at Jonathan Taylor, the person, it's an interesting story. He obviously has a great reverence for the running back tradition at Wisconsin. He's talked about that multiple times, including a story that actually a former colleague of mine at Fox Sports, Jesse Temple, who now works for The Athletic, penned over the summer. Had a nice feature on Jonathan Taylor in The Athletic, and there's a real reverence for some of the names on the wall in that running back room that Jonathan Taylor has. Alan Amishi, Ron Dane, more recently Monty Ball, obviously Melvin Gordon. Jonathan Taylor wants to be the next one in that line and even surpass that. And he's well on his way. He's got over 4,100 career rushing yards coming into this year. Get this, Blake. Only 2 other college football players all time have ever reached 3,500 yards through 2 seasons. Ron Dane, Wisconsin, and another guy named Herschel Walker, who had a pretty decent career for himself. So that's the type of company that Jonathan Taylor was in as a sophomore before he ever had a touch in his junior season. What he's focused on is really kind of transforming himself into an every down back, working on his receiving, his pass blocking. He actually spent some time with Melvin Gordon this offseason when Gordon was in town for a camp, and that seemed to really, rub off on Taylor. He's a humble guy. His parents have been interviewed multiple times, and they really talk about how they almost wish he'd act or play with a little more of an edge. There was a game last year where a defender clocked him, and Taylor, never phased, of course, pops right back up, helps up the defender, and his dad talked to him about it after the game and was like, you got to have a little more of an edge. Why are you helping him up? And he just said, Dad, I want him to know I'm going to keep coming at him. That's the mentality that it takes to be as successful of a player as Jonathan Taylor. He obviously has a ton of God-given talent, but putting the work in and staying motivated and staying self-accountable, that's how successful people attack life, frankly. Constantly asking yourself, how can I get better? Whether it's Blake, working on selling insurance, or myself in my marketing job. There have been countless defensive linemen who have taken ballet classes in college to work on their footwork. You see the pictures of, the Beatles slaving away in the wee hours of the morning trying to perfect their music. Shoot, John Paul II went to confession every day. So constantly asking, how can I get better? We're not comparing Jonathan Taylor to the Holy Father, obviously, but a great story and some great lessons from a humble kid from New Jersey who's got a huge payday coming, and has really been fun to watch, and looking forward to watching him do his thing against that Michigan defense this weekend.
Yeah, and I completely agree with everything you said as far as how great he's becoming, because I've really seen a huge difference between what he's looked like over the last 2 years to even this year.
How scary is that?
Which is
It's
crazy
terrifying.
because I think he was just a freak athlete.
Yep.
With running behind a big line, and was able to, accentuate a lot of his powers, his prowess. This year, I have seen the freakiest agility, power. I mean, he may give Saquon Barkley a run for his money. How
No
good
question.
he is.
I think he's in that company. I don't
Yeah.
think that's a stretch at all.
Yeah. So, man, this he could be. I mean, sucks for Wisconsin, but the guy should go pro over this next year.
They know that too. Paul Christ has gone to him before and essentially said when he's being recruited, we know we'll probably only have you for 3 years. They understand that, but what a 3 years it's been.
Yeah, and so my story is all about AJ Epinesa and his family. His dad came from American Samoa. He immigrated and went to college and played football at Iowa Wesleyan for a year, and then transferred as a walk-on to Iowa. Walked on and graduated, became a captain, all that jazz. Then his son, who he's from, I think it was someplace, EHS is the name of the high school. I'm driving me nuts that I can't think of the name of the school. Essentially a St. Louis suburb.
It's okay. We'll let it slide. It's all right.
Yeah. St. Louis suburb. And the guy just has these humble beginnings. He comes from, a suburban neighborhood, but he doesn't forget, because he actually runs a camp every summer of conditioning for the neighborhood. They have barbecues every week, a couple times a week in his parents' backyards. They play along. And it's just a great story of having family and bringing a neighborhood together, not forgetting where you came from, and just doing the right thing all the time. Pretty cool to see all that and how he can bring together a community. I'll put a link to the story. It came out this summer on one of those weird Iowa blogs. That's just my Nebraska fandom coming out, but really looking forward to hopefully people will check out the AJ Epinesa story a little bit.
If you have any doubt about how dedicated Blake is to the success of this program, the fact that he's actively seeking out information on Iowa football should tell you a lot. That also takes balls.
Huge.
We did something a little different this past week. We kind of put out a blast on Facebook and asked some of our followers, and we appreciate all of you who follow along on any of our social media channels, what you'd like us to talk about. And we want to continue to solicit that feedback. We want this to be fun. We want it to be a conversation. So a few questions from our audience that we'll kind of roll through here now. Alex asked us to kind of break down who we think the 5 best teams have been since the East-West split was created a few years ago. So an example might be like 2015 Iowa. Blake, you and I kind of started to take a stab at that, but realized it's a little challenging.
It's a little challenging because I'm actually going to go with all the division winners since it was created, because we've had this switch up from the Legends and Leaders division where Wisconsin and Nebraska actually played each other in the Big Ten championship at one point. And those were that was probably Nebraska's best team since joining the Big Ten. And then we actually, since the West has been created, the West has not been that great. The year that Iowa went undefeated in the Big Ten, I'm sorry, the West was not that great. Wisconsin was decent, but they weren't near as good as they had been in the years past. And even Northwestern last year. I'm actually going to say the best team was the Melvin Gordon team that actually lost to Penn State in the Big Ten championship game. Is probably the best team, most athletic team that probably had the best shot, even though, and I'm kind of combination of talent and who played who and all that stuff. But I'm sorry, Iowa just didn't play that many people. And I know this is a huge argument between Iowa fans and the rest of the Big Ten. But I'm sorry, I actually think the Iowa team the next year was actually better, but had a worse record. That's just my opinion. It's really hard to tell. And hopefully we start to see some of these teams start getting better. I mean, PJ Fleck, he's bringing up Minnesota, Purdue with Brom. Let's see what the Lovey Bears can do after. Maybe they'll have Peters for 2 years and finally have some continuity and maybe look a little bit better next year. I mean, that's the biggest thing. Lovey Bear's been in the Big Ten Conference for 3 years now and has had over 6 different starting quarterbacks.
It's unbelievable. Well, thank you, Alex, for submitting that question, that topic. Andrew wanted to know what we think is a realistic over-under win-loss for Nebraska for the rest of the season after seeing what the Huskers bring to the table through a few games. To your point, Blake, I think we're going to know a lot more after the next couple weeks. But, when you kind of look at the current betting line and sort of what the over-under should be, has it shifted in your mind, or where do you think Nebraska's at after kind of nothing ever goes as planned with this team in the past 20 years? Have you noticed that? It's already been a season that I don't think anyone could have even expected, and we're only 3 games in.
Yeah, and I think everybody expected the offense to play a lot better. 2 a.m.
There you go again.
I almost went all the way, though. I caught myself. Adrian Martinez, 2 a.m. He's for sure probably the best quarterback, or maybe the second best quarterback in the Big Ten Conference. And he's not playing that well, but mainly because he hasn't had any time. The play call, and it doesn't look like his coach has given him a lot of trust, but I don't know if it's necessarily because of him. I think it's because of the other people surrounding him, not getting enough time, not having enough receivers that know what the heck they're doing. So I actually think the current betting line is 8.5 over 100. That's updated from multiple different sites. So I'm actually looking at, if I look at the games going forward, so we already have one loss with Colorado, which we won't talk about ever again.
Yeah, we buried that last week.
I'm saying 90% chance, 90 to 95% chance we lose to Ohio State. I think they're going to just smash us. The talent gap is too large. Even though it is at Nebraska. Ohio State, there's nobody to look forward to. They play Michigan State the next week, and then they have a bye, I think. So
night game in Lincoln, though. Night game in Lincoln. Strange things.
Night game in Lincoln. They're going to be up for it. They're not going to miss. They're not going to miss it. And we have not been that great in Lincoln for a long time. We just haven't been that good. We haven't been that dominating. Why do I keep saying we? I need to start saying Nebraska. But
you'll have all next week to preview that game. They've got to get through the Illini first.
So Ohio State is still on top of the world. They're a playoff caliber team. Wisconsin, I'm not sure. I think they could be a playoff caliber team. Who knows, though? We just don't know. They haven't played anybody. So Whiskey's really good. But I think the game is played at Nebraska this year. So I'm actually going to give that a 50-50. Actually, I'm going to give the slight lean to Wisconsin at 70-30 Wisconsin chance. So pulling that win there. And I'm actually 50-50 on Iowa and Maryland. Maryland just scares me. They have a lot of athletes. They could put a game together. And Nebraska in recent past just haven't given me a lot to trust in. I would bet the under at this point, but I wouldn't be surprised because at 8.5, we're looking at 6-3 in the Big Ten with this prediction schedule. And I think it was 8-4 overall. 6-3 Big Ten, that could be a 3-way tie depending on how Nebraska does against Iowa and Wisconsin. So, I mean, there's still hope to get to the Big Ten championship at that point. What are your thoughts? Do you think that there's a chance? I mean, I think here's the thing is I wouldn't be surprised if Nebraska's O-line puts it together and they're still able to beat Wisconsin or Iowa and then pull off the Maryland or even lose to Wisconsin and go 7-2 in the Big Ten.
Yeah, I think Ohio
State.
I think your assessment is pretty spot on. It's hard to bet the over just based on what we've seen so far. I'm kind of stubborn, so I'm not backing off of my pick for them to win the division. Does that road look tougher than it did Did a lot of us maybe buy into the off-season hype a little bit? Potentially. I don't think anybody expected some of the challenges that Martinez and the offense has had. But you go off the data points you have, and what I keep going back to is just how much better Nebraska was at the end of last season than the beginning. And to your point, I think I could see Nebraska really improving as the year goes on.
Well, the funny thing that I had this freaking fruit fly that keeps going after me.
That's the clapping and snapping in the background you all hear.
Yeah. There's
fighting the forces of nature to get this episode recorded. It's dedication.
Yeah. The funny thing about it, though, is that I actually feel more confident than I did at the beginning of the year against Northwestern. More confident against Purdue.
Yeah, it's not like Nebraska's
against Indiana.
Yeah.
So, but then the games that I was more confident against Wisconsin than going into the year. Going into the year than I am now. Iowa, I'm still 50-50 on because I think the way they play football leaves a lot to be desired. They're just not putting up enough points, honestly, and putting a lot of pressure on their defense. And the bend don't break. They're not quite just bend don't break. They play really well, really good defense.
Sure.
You can only do that for so long. Defenses break. Even the best do. Look at Ohio State when they got smashed by Penn State one year. They got smashed by Purdue. They got smashed by Wisconsin. They got smashed by Iowa. You got to be able to put up points and win a shootout a couple times. I don't think I can do that.
Now you play with fire, you get burnt. So if you're asking me to predict, just based on what we've seen so far, it's hard for me to predict that Nebraska's going to beat Ohio State. I think that's going to be a very entertaining, close game. It's hard for me to predict that they're going to beat Wisconsin. I actually think they're going to come to play against Iowa and beat Iowa. Obviously, a lot can happen between now and then. The Maryland game scares me. It has, just based on where it falls on the schedule, kind of your classic, I know it's cliche, but trap game. I'm not the only person who's said that. So it kind of aligns with what you're saying. You know, you come out of that one unscathed. It's 2 losses in conference, and your chances of going to Indianapolis are pretty good. So I think that's best case scenario at this point, but we're going to know more next week and the week after that, and then more is going to happen. And especially with this team, there's going to be all kinds of topsy-turvy things, and we'll see where things kind of shake out at the end of the year.
And people are going to probably start asking, like, well, where's Wisconsin getting their 3 losses? Where's Iowa getting their 3 losses? Let's just run down a couple of the places that they could lose. They could lose this week to Michigan. That's a conference loss. They could lose to Michigan State. I know they don't look that great, but they could. They play Ohio State again. They could lose to Nebraska. That's 4. They could lose to Iowa. That's 4 or 5 games that are close to 50-50, if not maybe 70-30 or 60-40 chances. Those are all losable games.
Well, and let's be honest, the reason this division, a big reason this division is so wide open is because of the schedule that maybe that second tier of team has. Minnesota has a much softer schedule. Nebraska's schedule, to your point, sets up easier than some of the teams at the top of our power rankings right now. So
Wisconsin and I have the 2 toughest in the division.
Right, and they're probably the 2 best teams
Michigan
at this point.
Yeah.
Yep. So we'll see how it shakes out. Andrew, thanks for bringing that up. A great discussion. We'll see if we're idiots or if we kind of know what we're talking about. It's a good question.
Hey, finally, I went 3-3-1 this week.
Well, congrats. That's an improvement, I think, right?
It is actually.
Finally,
I lost the video.
Another Nebraska question from Tim. I believe, I don't want to step too far out on a limb and make any assumptions. I believe Tim might be trolling just a little bit asking this question, but he asked.
It's what we call poop posting.
Was hiring Scott Frost a mistake? Yes, obviously. Scott Frost has done nothing to prove that he belongs in Division I as a head coach. He's been at Nebraska far long enough to have been successful to this point. He didn't inherit any problems at all, and they should probably seriously consider looking elsewhere on the hot seat with those hot, tight pants, I would say.
Dang it. I was going to say, plus he wears hot pants.
No, still your thunder. I'm sure that's not the last time that'll happen. But in all seriousness, we talked about it last week, and I won't belabor the point. if Scott Frost can't do it in Nebraska, nobody can do it at Nebraska. He was a perfect hire for this program. They're so early in his tenure. You look at the players who have performed very well for Nebraska this year, the young guys that are surprising, a lot of them were already recruited by Scott Frost's staff. Give it time.
110 new players since he took over.
And that's what it takes. That program had a gigantic culture problem, and those things don't get fixed overnight. He's made strides in leaps and bounds, and we'll hopefully see that bear itself out on the field the rest of the season.
Yep.
So I believe that's going to do it. Again, be sure to check us out on Facebook, on Twitter. We're on SoundCloud and YouTube. Blake will post his picks. We'll post the power rankings as well. Be sure to subscribe too, so you're able to access our content as easily and have it fed to you as possible. And one more time, throw us a note on Facebook, tweet at us, shoot us an email. We're also on the interwebs at simplythewest.wixsite.com/simplythewest. You can get at us on there as well. Always looking for feedback. How can we make this better? What would you like to hear us talk about? Any closing thoughts or remarks from you, Blake? Or are you going to go try to see if you can maybe score one more cheeseburger before bed here?
You just tempted me. Now I'm going to have to go do that.
Well, you're welcome. I always try to be a good influence. Thank you, sir. Thank you all for listening. For Blake Molly, I'm Phil Irvin. This has been the Simply the West podcast. We will talk to you next week.